Once upon a time, there was a man with a vision of something that could be done with a ruined industrial landscape, a china clay quarry in the hills of Cornwall. He talked about what could be made of it, how it could become something wonderful, and he wrote down that vision, and this is what he said. I said that I wanted a samba beat. I wanted a wow factor 11, that it had to be Picasso meets the Aztecs in full Technicolor. We talked for hours of the drama that we wanted to unfold, of how unsuspecting visitors would be drawn towards us, catching no more than a tantalizing glimpse of what lay in store. Once at the arrival point, they would walk down to the visitor center where, for the first time, they would see into the bowels of the crater, where stretched beneath them would be a civilization the like of which existed only in the imagination of romantics. We wanted them first to be awestruck at the sheer bravura of the architecture and the landscape design, and then, all cynicism put aside for a moment, wonder why we did it. They had to be David Livingstone to our Victoria Falls. Scenes so lovely must have been gazed upon by angels in their flight, was what he said on first seeing them. Under these circumstances, maybe, just maybe, people would be in the right frame of mind to be humbled by the power of plants to shape our destinies. Tim Smit, now Sir Tim Smit, is an imaginative, dynamic, and persuasive fellow. After 15 years and £144 million sterling, his Eden project is one of the wonders of the world. It used to be a monstrous, devastated china clay quarry in rural Cornwall. It's now an enormous educational theme park dedicated to exploring the complete dependence of human beings on plants. That's not a relationship that many of us even think about. The Eden Project is also a spectacular demonstration of how a wasted and ravaged industrial landscape can be converted into a site of great beauty, bursting with life, endlessly alluring. Because it draws hundreds of thousands of visitors, the project is also a powerful demonstration of social entrepreneurship, revealing the capacity of art, entertainment, and education to rejuvenate the economy of what was once a thoroughly depressed area. And it's also, like much else in life according to Smit, about the incredible power of story. My friends, meet Tim Smit. Let me ask first, how do you pronounce the name of the garden that preceded the Eden Project?
You mean the Lost Gardens of Illigan?
Illigan, that was the pronunciation I couldn't get.
Although, to be honest, it depends on our mood whether we say Illigan or with the emphasis on the second part, or Helligan, which is more British. And it depends whether I'm talking to people who've got a good sense of hearing or not, to be honest. When you say Illigan, they can never spell it.
Right. Well, you had two careers, really, before you even saw those gardens, right? You started as an archaeologist, you'd had a very successful career as a music producer, and then you had what you called a Fitzcarraldo moment when you saw those gardens. Tell me about that moment.
I think all of us have moments in our life where you reflect on who you are and whether you are making the best use of the time allotted to you at one level. And the second part of that such a question is, are you being honest to yourself? And I think one of the great depressions I notice in many, many people I meet is that when you go to college or university, you have a kind of rose-tinted view of what grown-up life will be like, that you'll be in a job that so challenges you and so inspires you that you stretch every fibre of your sinew. And then you get into the workplace and you discover something which is really embarrassing, which is that you're quite smart. And you realise that a lot of people are smart, and in order to be good-mannered, no one admits to being smart, so everybody starts to busk it. So no one is, or very few people I know, actually stretch every fibre of their being. And an awful lot of people I know waste huge chunks of their life being polite about the fact that they're smart, and spend hours having meetings that could take 5 minutes, days writing things that could actually be summarised in one paragraph, and so on. And for me, my Fitzcarraldo moment, for those of you who are not familiar with it, the film, it's a wonderful film by Werner Herzog, in which Fitzcarraldo, the eponymous Fitzcarraldo, goes up the Amazon with a giant boat to build an opera house in the middle of the Amazon because it had to be done. And I adored that film because there's something in the human spirit that demands beauty and madness to actually uplift us, and those who are nurtured simply by the act of consumption usually do not take the human condition any further. And for me, there is something about beauty that is really important, and the word has somehow been stolen from us as if it was an add-on, something that would be a nice to have. And yet my work at Helligan, my work in the music industry, my work here has shown me time after time a world of surprises, that the things that uplift people are the sign of the human spirit alive in doing things that are beautiful and not necessary, but they tell you something about our spirit, which is really, really important. And I was made to think about that a lot actually recently when we were talking to the guys who run Pixar in America, you know, the wonderful cartoon studio, and they were trying to describe what made them as good as they are, which is actually a form of idiotic madness, which is that they cannot bear to not paint the back of the screens they're filming. The camera will never pick it up, but they would never be satisfied knowing that they were unfinished. And I understand that completely. And so my Fitzcarraldo moment was arriving at a point in my life where I didn't want to be in the music business anymore. I found the gardens that became the Lost Gardens of Helligan. And I just had a sense that this was a moment that was meant to be for me. And it took me 45 minutes of cutting through undergrowth to decide to change my career. And I had no idea of a business plan. All I knew about plants was that it was green side up. Honestly, I was that ignorant. But I just had a feeling from what I'd learned in the music industry was that if you love something and you're not a freak, there will be millions of people who feel the same way. Therefore, the simple issue is one of marketing. Let people know about what you're doing and they will come. Well, you've probably seen some years ago that marvelous Kevin Costner movie, Field of Dreams, Build It and They Will Come. And that always struck with me because that felt just totally real to me. That whole idea that actually most of us, we get grayer, and you know, me and you, we've got faces like topographic maps, haven't we? But inside, is it not true that we're 17, 18 in many respects? Luckily, we're a bit wiser in some other respects. But actually, the desire for adventure and the desire for stretching the bounds of what we think are limits or boundaries remains very vivid in those of us who have a curiosity. And I think that is the inspiration for me doing Helligan and Eden, is actually to build things, to make things that inspire other people of curiosity to go and do things that inspire them.
Which is how we got here. Actually, and then the gardens were, just to touch briefly on that for people who don't know what the Lost Gardens were, this was an enormous Victorian formal garden that had been completely overgrown, and that you brought back to life.
The gardens at Helligan are part of an estate called Helligan Estate, which overlooks a fishing village of Mevagissey in South Cornwall. And they were originally laid out in 1780 as the seat of the Tremaine family. The word seat means where the family resided. And they built over the period of the next 100 years a range of gardens that were very idiosyncratic. It was as if, you've got to think, those of you watching this film, Cornwall is right on the end of Britain. It's the little toe that sticks out in the ocean. After us, it's America. And it was an awful long way to get to London. So if you like, the stately home owning classes who lived down there and a bit, perhaps even in Devon, they tended to make their social life more parochial. They weren't players in the city. They would go up once a year to be in the city, but actually they made a very strong social commitment to where they were. And that's important in terms of what followed, because they obviously went on a grand tour and saw lots of marvellous gardens and came back and did kind of tiny versions of them. So there's, you know, a northern summer house that looks out over the western approaches. There are little grottos, crystal grottos, and the crystal in the grotto would reflect the moonlight. But they weren't grand like a Stour Head and things like that. They were all kind of sketch versions of things. And why people eventually loved the gardens when we opened to the public was because although the gardens as a whole are about 200 acres, there are no structures or parts of them that an ordinary person like us wouldn't say, oh, I'd like to have one of those. You know, a lot of the big stately home ones, you go, crikey, they had a lot of money. I could never imagine that. So the thing that was interesting about Helligan was that it's unique, not in terms of any of its structures, but that you have a jungle garden and you have productive gardens and, productive gardens, walled gardens and big vegetable gardens that all gone from 1915 because the head gardener and his crew, with the outbreak of the First World War in the August of 1914, over the next 18 months, all of them enlisted, and very sadly, over 2/3 of them were to die in the First World War. And John-Claude Tremaine, who was the then squire, was very close to his staff, and he just couldn't bear the loss. So he put a fence up around it. He decided to leave his stately home, which had been used as a shell shock hospital during the First World War. And from that day through till our arrival in 1990, only a very few people had actually even gone in to what had been the garden. So when I arrived there in 1990, in the January of 1990, you've got to imagine a scene of the whole garden was just overgrown, but to a degree that is almost unimaginable. I mean, there were brambles at 15 feet high across the whole site and ivy, and there'd been a hurricane, which is a very rare event in Britain, in the January the 24th, 1990, in which over 100 major trees had been pushed over. So it was like going to it was like a garden of giants with these huge trees all akimbo and completely overgrown. And the only bit that we found that was sort of even vaguely there was the walls of the biggest of the walled gardens was there. But I just fell hopelessly in love with it, because for me it wasn't about gardening, it was about, imagine, if you will, you arrived in a place and you suddenly see, we'd cut our way into a vinery where the glass was hanging where the wood previously had been, but it was now hanging on ivy and brambles because the wood had long ago rotted out. And I cut my way in very gingerly so as not to be guillotined. But there's suddenly, like those strange paintings, those dot paintings that came out in the 80s, where you're supposed to look at lots of dots and suddenly say, oh, I see the elephant in the middle of it. I could never do that, but I was in the middle of this vinery and I saw some vine scissors hanging on a nail on the wall. And once my eyes had picked up the vine scissors, I suddenly started to see terracotta pots and shears and stuff everywhere. And it was as if someone had said, time for tea, fully intending to return, and no one did. It was the oddest thing. And I felt hope. It's like the Mary Celeste. But it felt very romantic. And the moment that made me actually decide that there was no way of going back, that I had to do this thing, was when we were messing around in this room. There's a tiny room that you may have seen at Elegant, which is the Thunderbox Room, the old toilet. And in the plaster, once we'd cleaned off all the ivy, we saw in faint pencil marks, someone had put quotation marks around, come ye not here to sleep nor to slumber, it had said. And all the garden staff, one by one, after they'd been sitting on the old Thunderbox, had signed their names, and it was dated August 1914, which is very, very poignant. So my inspiration behind wanting to do Heligan was that I wanted to tell the story which had never been told in Britain before, of the ordinary men and women who'd made a garden like that great, rather than the story of the blue bloods, the lords and ladies. And it was a very poignant story, and it was also, I think, an important story, because you've got to remember that by 1919, throughout Britain, the institutions that had been charged with looking after our history had bulldozed all the major glass houses and things. The National Trust didn't have a single working glass house or wall garden. Not one. Nothing. And Chatsworth, which had had the greatest of the glass house complexes, because of course that's where Joseph Paxton had been head gardener, they bulldozed it completely to the point of turning it into a caravan park, where basically the birth of British productive horticulture had taken place. And the oddest thing is that it's like someone had stolen a story off the people and had erased it. Because when we decided to restore the productive gardens, everybody said, why are you doing that? You know, everybody else has knocked them down. But the moment film came out on television of us doing it, the crowds poured in. And if you were to ask most people who come to Ligon what they love the most, it's the potting shed. And the amount of people who've said to me, my grandfather probably wasn't a head gardener, but when I walk in there, I believe that my past was part of this. You know, that smell of loam, the terracotta pots, the sisal, the tools, you know, the zinc mixing bench with the compost and creosote. It's just fantastic. And that would lead me inexorably to be doing the Eden Project, because I understood, intuitively sounds a funny way of putting it, but I understood that there was something very profound about this need to have got soil under your fingernails, There was something about the process of the seasons managed, because as you know, when you talk about Heligan being Victorian, you're quite right, it's productive gardens, their heyday are Victorian. But what's really weird is that you have woodland gardens, wild gardens all around, and then suddenly this severe mathematic, because the Victorians, the productive gardens were literally to the centimetre and straight lines and everything. And that counterpoint between the control of nature and nature going wild is, as a metaphor, very, very powerful. And I think that's why Heligan has so many visitors, because people intrinsically understand that nature, what real nature is not something to which we should be using the words control and conquer. But gardening is all about control and conquering, and it's very, very unnatural. And I think people find that very strange and moving, but also a bit worrying, because we have issues about Arcadia and noble savagery, don't we? And I think many of us in the environment movement have been dyed in the wool with notions of nobility and Edens in the past, paradises that are somehow being lost or trampled underfoot by us, which are perhaps not helpful 21st century models, because it tends to argue against pragmatism with a heart of gold and actually turns into a strange form of zealotry, which I'm not sure wins the argument. It just makes you feel better about having vented your spleen about what's wrong with the world. And I think, to me, rooting it in the tradition of people who are growing things and getting dirt under their fingernails is a really important starting proposition, because that's real. It's about actually doing stuff. And if you don't know about really doing stuff, you're not really fit to discuss the theory of growing things or husbanding nature. So that's a terribly long-winded answer.
No, it's a perfect answer, actually, and it brings out two of the things that are striking to me when I look at your life, your career, your interests, and the achievement of Eden, which you would be the first I know to say, well, yes, we were kind of the spark for that, but there's been a huge amount of other energy into it. But the two things that strike me, one of them is story. It seems to me that you've got some wonderful comments about story. That the stories of the great plant hunters, the gardens and the plants that changed the world are irresistible. And I want you to tell me a couple of those stories, if you would. The other thing that I guess strikes me about this is the stories, but also the plants. That the other dominant theme is we don't really understand. Most of us, most of the time, our relationship to plants. We don't really grasp how vital they are to everything else.
That's true. I think one of the problems with plants is that they have, for at least 3 or 4 generations, been associated almost with class and age. That gardening was actually done by blue-collar people for people who were white-collar. But when it was a leisured activity, it was definitely very, very middle class and about values that were, I don't know, a bit ephemeral. And I think because plants can't sing and they can't dance, they have been kind of trivialized in terms of, yes, let's go around a beautiful garden, but gardening is something like a backcloth against which to have a social life, you know. I think for me, because I didn't come at gardening that way, I was fascinated by something missing in the story. When I began the idea of Eden and we started to look at what our point of difference was, what struck me pretty much like a punch on the nose, it wasn't even a slight thing, was how no botanic garden in the world had actually themselves realized or made public the single most important thing about plants. Not one of them. Nowhere did it say, without plants, there is no life on Earth. Isn't that amazing? Mm-hmm. All this tradition. And that's because I guess the botanic garden tradition, which has now been glorified into a story of conservation, was basically an arm in Britain, certainly of the British East India Company and foreign imperial adventures to create wealth through exploiting rubber, cocoa, whatever it would be. And of course, the very first crop that they really wanted to exploit was the most important crop on Earth, which is the great trick question. Of course, what is the single most important crop that's changed the world more than any? And I wonder whether you can tell me.
I don't think I can.
The answer is cinchona, quinine.
Ah, yes.
It's a
Okay.
trick question,
Yeah.
of course
Well,
it is. But quinine enabled white explorers to be able to go into the tropical fastnesses and exploit them without dying, which is a huge thing. So that's why the British tried to steal cinchona plants from Chile and Peru and get them planted in India and in Malaya and various other places to give them an advantage in terms of the colonial exploits. And the war about spices and medicinal crops, and in fact productive crops like rubber, is huge. I mean, it was just an extraordinary tale which, if you were trying to make a parallel with, let's say, late 1700s, early 1800s, you're talking about these plant hunters and the organizations sending them out as being the equivalent of our dot-com billionaires now. Now, that's the equivalent of your Bill Gateses and Steve Jobs and Larry Ellison. That was who these people were, because it would transform the world, these crops. And of course, people know that. I guess instinctively, a lot of people, it's a kind of a sixth form level education, you'd understand that. But I wanted to convey not only the story that we are dependent on the natural world, totally dependent, that if you look at a plant's leaf, it is more effective than about 100 nuclear power stations in terms of the way it is designed for photosynthesis. And it struck me that a plant was if you could get people to think about plants in a different way, it could start a narrative about working with the grain of nature, which wasn't about muesli weaving and alternative medicine. It was about, whoa, these damn creatures they can't move, and they've had to adapt to all different weathers and creatures that want to eat them and everything else, and they've evolved brilliantly. Look at their cellular structure, look at the way we build huge solid beams, and yet bamboo, which is far stronger, has got a really, really clever structure. We should be learning from this stuff. So that kind of biomimicry thing came very strongly to me. So I saw my job, after Heligan, the Eden idea was really to develop the notion that there is a great new renaissance to be had in terms of working with the grain of nature in a different way. And I think that's the big debate of the 21st century, isn't it? Which is, how can we live sustainably without having to have a hair shirt narrative about we're going to have to give things up. The human psyche is such that if we have to give things up, we will all die, because they won't give it up. They can't. We're addicted to consumption. Therefore, you've got to work out what do you think about growth. And economically, growth has always been seen as the growth of gross domestic product, for example. And I think there's a really interesting backstory when you look at the great environmental economists, people like Emery Lovins. For example, if you read Factor 4 or then his later book, Factor 10, it's about how can you take the same product and get 10 times more use from it. And I've recently had a wonderful demonstration of this by Michael Paulin, the architect, who showed me photographs of a 30-foot high steel post. It was square, 18 inches by 18 inches. And when you photographed it, you could see where the stress points were in it. The next picture is someone had just cut out all the steel that wasn't on a stress point, which made it about 30% of the original weight. Then photographed again, cut it all out into a filigree work. So it's a really fragile looking thing, and it's like a very gentle, curved pillar. The end product weighs 4% of the original steel pillar, and it's twice as strong. Now that is really interesting, because at 4%, that means you could get 25 beams, whereas previously you had one. So maybe we can actually handle a population of 9 billion if we're really smart.
But it's going to take that kind of smarts, isn't it? It's going to
but to be honest, I'm a pirate king. The way I look at the world is this: if we fry, we deserve it. You can write as much poetry as you like about the end of the world, but the world can do without us. I think the greatest joke of all is we chose to call ourselves Homo sapiens, the wise hominid. Well, either we are, or we're not. But if we're not, it's a wonderful joke, and we deserve to go. And if we are, we're about to face a time where we've got to prove it.
Yeah. And which way are we going to go, in your estimation?
I am increasingly optimistic, and I'm optimistic because the internet, as we could both talk till the cows come home about, its benefits and disbenefits. But one of the benefits of it is that it enables people to challenge and question things and group themselves together in such a way that people can't hide behind glib stories. I think more and more we're finding that certain decisions are having to be defended not with lies but in terms of realpolitik. So for example, as opposed to saying burning fossil fuels isn't damaging the world, most people would say now fossil fuels are damaging the world, but in realpolitik we've got to still keep using them while we find an alternative. Most people won't see that as a big shift. That is a monster shift. It means that once you've accepted that you've got to run the world in terms of a realpolitik, the realpolitik has got to take account of the natural systems, the natural ecosystems that we need to depend on, and the impact and cost of that. And I think what we're going to see over the next 5-10 years is an accounting system. I hate this, by the way. I hate it, but I understand that the sort of people who are the rule makers in the world are predominantly anal and only understand figures, outputs, outcomes. They don't feel able to see a moral imperative as an argument. It has to be a monetized one. Well, if that's the game we've got to play, let's play it hard. Let us play the game which demonstrates that the natural services we use, whether it be the air cleaning or oxygen creating or water cleaning services of forests and so on, and actually work that into the way we cost our businesses. And then, to be honest, if I was being really fierce, we need to hold an entire profession of accountancy to account for their criminal, treasonous performance in the face of global need. What on earth are they doing as a profession, calling themselves auditors from auditare to here? The original accountants, auditors, went to look at estates in the Roman days and judged whether they were fit for purpose, whether they were actually working well with the land, whether everything was in good heart, the land was in good heart. And somehow we've got a profession of people who haven't actually realized they had any duty other than to generally limited companies in which they have not taken account of the cost of those companies on the rest of us, just the costs of that company in terms of money going in and out, or reserves held or not held. Which, when you think about it, is it even a profession? I doubt it. To be honest, if I was a rich man, if I was a very rich man, I would love to challenge them all. They're so slow. They're disgustingly slow in terms of changing their habits. And now, because we've got carbon, which is something that is measurable, like children, they say, oh, let's all go down the carbon route. And of course, we've now got a debate which is all about fossil fuels and low carbon future. But it is a lot more complicated than that. It's simply because it's a dull end of a stick that is measurable, that everybody's grabbing onto it as if the whole world's going to be saved by being, having a lower carbon future. There are many other things that we're doing which are equally as heinous. But sorry, I get quite hot on the collar about it.
That's fine. That's what we're here for. What are some of those other things? I do want to bring you back to the Eden Project, but this is the backdrop against which this is the thinking out of which this wonderful project came. Right?
Yeah.
So that's what I want to hear about.
Well, I'm a capitalist. I believe in the clubbing together of capital to create wider benefit and profit. And I hate the way the environment movement and a lot of political parties have not understood the nature of our civilization and the need to create wealth. Because the very simple assumption has been made, which is not necessary, which is that corporate activity by definition means you have to exact a price from the environment. Unfortunately, because it so far has meant that, people have been unable to imagine a future in which that is not the case. So that's why I'm hot on the collar about accountants, and also why I cannot understand why governments have not understood that if you're going to give companies the right to operate as if they were an individual, distinct to the boards that run them, surely, getting really angry about this, surely if you were a prudent government, you would give people the limited liability status in return for one golden share which belonged to the government, which gave you the right to be that company. And that golden share meant that every auditor, when they audit the company, have to audit it in the national interest, that would have got round an awful lot of this.
It would. It would.
Because maximising profit could only then take place in the context that it had never acted outside of the national interest. And sure as hell, putting your bleaches and nasties into a river which kills the fish and kills the algae and kills the ocean where the river comes out, or pumps rotten air up, and you can write the story. I just think we must never apportion responsibility to inanimate things when actually the heartbeat that set them up in the first place was governed by greed and stupidity. We've got to call it like it is. And one of the problems I've discovered running Eden is that I am a capitalist. I am about as establishment a figure as you can get in many ways, which breaks my heart sometimes. But of course, I realized long ago that the way the establishment works is that if you're too alternative, they are able to define you as being other and therefore not relevant. And therefore you've actually got to almost play the establishment game in order to be able to change it. And that's also a dangerous game, because I know many people who said, I've sold out so I can change things from within, and suddenly it became too comfortable being inside to say the unpleasant and necessary things. So I'm aware of the dangers of the desire to belong, and I, on a fairly regular basis, insist on insulting someone, if only it's for the sake of it. Just, I'm being trivial here, but in order just to keep in practice for not selling out.
Well, you couldn't have done Eden if you hadn't been able to get the ear of people who could get the ear, who could get the ear of people who could bring the resources needed. And it's, what, 144 million pounds,
That's right.
Something like that? You know, you can't muster that kind of resources if you don't have people trusting you, if you don't have people believing you can do it, and if they don't see you as a sort of a solid chap that's not going to, not just a dreamer, but somebody who can actually do the thing, right?
No, it's true. It is true that we couldn't have built this without a narrative where a lot of people saw the advantage and adventure in doing it. And having done Helligan before was helpful because everybody had said that was mad. Therefore, they didn't look at this project as being as mad as they might have done. Although I do often remind people of the old scam where you borrow a tenner, then you pay it back quickly, borrow 100, pay it back quickly, borrow 1,000, you pay it back quickly. You get up to 1 million and suddenly you run.
Yes. But you can't run with this enormous crater in the ground full of wonderful things, right?
Yeah. No, but you rightly say, I mean, Eden may well have been the product of my fevered imagination at one point, but the Eden you see today is actually the product of many people, and what we are today is different to when we began. It was basically a botanic institution with a difference, if you like. I always used to say we were the world's first rock and roll scientific foundation. A bit glib, but it kind of was smiley to say it that way. I think what I was really trying to say was that my lesson of Helligan was that if you tell stories and you make the world of plants come to life, and you use a language that, you know, the man on the Clapham omnibus would understand, you can get a much wider audience and people actually buying into what you wanted to do. And I think it was only through building Eden and understanding the power of capital. So, for example, we're very political here. We believe in local sourcing, and we're draconian in terms of the way we insist on it. We have 2,400 suppliers. A huge majority of those, over 80% of them, are, you know, from here in Cornwall, because we realize that it's like that mafia saying, if people around you make money, you'll live a long and happy life. And that's a trite way of putting it, that actually, if you want to be part of a community, demonstrate you're part of that community. And if you have companies that serve you, you could put your brand, Eden, at their service. And the best way you can help companies in a rural environment, and this goes back to my capitalist thinking, is the traditional good business thing is to buy just on time, to order just when you need it. You know, it's good business. Short-term contracts, keep them competitive, keep them lean and mean. You can't build a business as a small business a long way from London if that is the way your contracts are done. How on earth are you going to be able to grow your business? Because if you're always doing just-in-time orders and short-term contracts, how are you going to persuade a bank to lend you the money over the medium term to be able to make you grow? So we deliberately started offering longer term contracts, and we tied the longer term contracts. Obviously, that if the local sourcing was more expensive than getting it from up country, we investigated that quite thoroughly, because we were keen that we were prepared to pay more if it was produced locally, if the only reason it was more expensive was by virtue of our geography. But we didn't want to make the mistake of having it more expensive by virtue of their incompetence. So we were quite sort of hard about that. But now there are loads of companies that have done well with Eden and have got markets up country, in fact internationally, through working with us. And I'm really proud of that. And this brings me back to the perils of public funding and accountancy, because whether you're in Canada, America or England, that if you only look at the financial value of a particular act, you miss so much value. So for example, if you take £144 million, no bank in the world would lend you £144 million against a turnover of £23 million. They just wouldn't do it. It's crazy. However, what state wouldn't rip your arm out your shoulder blades for saying, you invest 144 million and we will put 100 million back in the economy every year? We've put 1.2 billion back into the economy. The state didn't invest all of it in here, but I'm trying to make a point that benefit is in many different ways. When you look at, we got 437 people work here. Those were jobs that were not here. This is a level of very high unemployment. And I think as nations, it doesn't matter whether it's Canada or America here, that if our public servants live by a rigid mantra of the state shouldn't give you handouts or whatever, that is very blind. That is politically very blind. And I like to think that we're smarter than that, and we can actually look at where the state can intervene in such a way that actually what it is oiling the machine that then creates much more wealth. Where it shouldn't intervene is where they invest in areas of tokenistic advantage, which don't bring you that added wealth, but for a moment make it look as if a government is doing something. But I think there's a grown-up narrative that we can have in the West about how we have state interventions, which actually are the phrase I often use is the straw that breaks the camel's back of local resistance or local opportunity.
You also owed something to the community. You remarked, and I think it's very astute, I've done a little bit of community economic development myself, and you remarked at one point that if your local community won't back you, everyone else has an exit. That you've got to start with having the community believe in it, which I suppose is the Tinkerbell theory, right? Mm-hmm. But if everybody believes in it, and then you can go forward, there is no escape to say, well, this is just you. It's not just you now, it's the whole community. Right?
That's right. I think one of the most difficult things you have when you've got a lot of book learning and then you face the real world is we're all Democrats until we meet real people. And then you go, oh my giddy aunt, I'm not sure I want those guys making a decision on my future. The joke, of course, is that each and every one of us is probably thinking the same. And that's one of the joys of democracy. I realized, no, that's a lie. I didn't realize, I hoped massively, which is a different sentiment, that if you had a true democratic process, the right result would occur. We often confuse the word democracy with having a vote, whereas I've come to think of democracy as being about having all the information at your fingertips. A vote is cheap, but actually if you don't give people the right information, they have no basis on which to make a sensible decision. So we set out on a course. We actually advertised that we would not seek to build the Eden Project unless we had the mandate from the people around us. Just to be clear, what we meant was we were not even going to apply to the council to build it until we'd got a general sense of belief in it. And we had 20 local meetings in village halls all around our boundary, and we showed them our plans. And what was really interesting was, I guess there was a couple of hundred people turned up to the first one, and loads of people made suggestions. And when we had the second one, a lot of the same people turned up, but now the audience was even bigger. And the moment they saw that we'd actually listened to them and had changed our plans in many cases to take account of their concerns, the whole atmosphere really changed as they realized that we were doing a genuine consultation rather than we're telling you what we're doing and that's it, which is what an awful lot of consultations are. Anyway, by the time we got to consultation number 17, on the day of it, we realized we had a problem so big that it might end the Eden project, which was that the highways people were saying we have to have a new road. And there is nowhere to build a new road to Eden. And we were really honest about this at this parish meeting. We said, today, might have seen the end of it. Anyway, it was up at Penwithwick, this meeting, which is the village near us on the western boundary. And this old lady who'd come along, she said, I won't try and do the accent, but it was a wonderful accent. She said something like, ear. I remember in 1940, there was a road through that wasteland to the south of us called the Burma Road. And it was all, I remember it being built, it's properly metalled and everything underneath. And she said, make a marvellous road it would, and it would take all the lorries and heavy goods vehicles out of our village. It turns out that this brownfield land had now got so overgrown, it had been made a site of special scientific interest and had all sorts of preservation orders on it. But we were suddenly in the brilliant position where all our community wanted a road. And so we were able to write to Natural England and saying the community wants a road across your special thing. If you were building a road, how would you build it so it was good for nature? And it was really weird because it was such a different position to be in for them. So they wrote back and said, well, look, it'll cost you a third more if you do this, but you need runs for badgers and hedgehogs, you need runoff bits for if there's any oil spilt, it goes and it gets filtered. It was a whole list. And so we said, fine. So I doubt there is anywhere in Britain, if I had a hat, I'd say I'd eat my hat, right? I doubt there is anywhere in Britain where someone has had the idea to build a new road, has got planning permission for it, it's 3 miles long, and it's gone through a site of special scientific interest, from imagining to the first vehicle going down it, 18 months. No. Yeah. And the reason is because we believed in the wisdom of the people. And that sounds like a political thing to say. And sometimes I don't have the courage for it. Sometimes I back off and whatever. But as a generality, I have found so far doing Eden that wherever you have the time to give those that you're talking to all the information on which you're making a decision, they will generally come up with the same opinion that you have. And where you get significant disagreement is where you haven't been frank or open. And I guess there's a second part to that, which is that where you are frank and open, the relationship of trust you've established means that they may say, look, I don't actually like what you're doing there, but how's about that? As opposed to just no, which is a really different perspective.
In the whole development of this quite stupendous project, you commented at one point that you never really doubted that it would succeed. And that strikes me as just remarkable. And how is that possible that you could foresee something this big, requiring the participation of so many players of different interests and so forth, and still feel so confident that it was going to go forward?
It's really difficult to have this narrative honestly, because I think one of our problems as humans is that we always write our past backwards. You create a sense of shape and pattern and inevitability out of what actually probably was chaotic, but you just pick the bones out of it and make something completely, legible in the past.
That's storytelling, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is storytelling. Yes, you're right. You miss out the vital bits. Yeah, but it is certainly true. I never actually really doubted it, but that isn't. I'd like to be careful in the way I phrase this so that it doesn't appear that there was some kind of arrogant madman who never doubted himself. It wasn't that. It was almost, for me, it was almost like the guy who's gone onto the high diving board and knows he's going to jump, knows there is a chance of a belly flop, knows there's a chance that the elastic on his swimming trunks isn't strong enough and he's going to end up naked in the pool, but he knows that he's going to jump. And that if enough people share the fear of the belly flop and the nakedness in the pool with you, it is going to be unstoppable. And I think my confidence in it all came from understanding something which I wish a lot more people understood, which is that as humans, if you stop focusing on our uniqueness and our difference, we're all pretty similar in many respects. We all fear our death. We all wonder whether we're underachieving, or whether we're brave enough, or whether we're cautious enough, depending on, or responsible enough. I mean, we have so many images we play around in our heads and try and fit ourselves to. And in fact, I think many of us go through life trying to reinvent ourselves sometimes because we've tried a position like that and we got rather bored with ourselves. Or, you know, I'm bored with being a po-faced environmentalist. I'm now going to become trailer trash, you know, or whatever. You know, but that's a bit of an extreme version. But I think my insight, if that's not a pretentious word, is that I realized that big, it was the scale of the ambition that made it much more likely to be successful. Because actually, if your story makes sense and it's big, everybody you're talking to, you're saying at one level, please give us some money and help. On another, you're saying, in terms of your tombstone, it's going to say you were involved in one of the great adventures. Wouldn't you rather have that? You know, I was a bit cruel at some points in talking to people about, was it Dick Scott, the guy who turned down the Beatles, saying that guitar bands won't turn on? Do you want to be one of those guys? I mean, I'm really sorry, I don't want to meet your grandchildren if you're one of those. And I say that with a very light touch, but it was very interesting how Gay, who's the Joint Chief Executive here now, she describes it actually really well in terms of being like country dancing, which sounds like a funny phrase. But the biggest act of making Eden possible was after lots of people said they would contribute, it became like, we'll contribute if they contribute, and we'll contribute if they contribute. We suddenly had this thing of, who the hell's going to be first? And there was, when I say that there was never a moment when I doubted it, there was a moment, not when I doubted we were going to build it, but I felt as though I was staring into this bizarre pit of everybody wants it, but there's no mechanism for everybody to jump at once. So we could end up with everybody splendidly wanting to do it, but we haven't found the secret to getting them to go. And Gay was largely responsible for finding a story that enabled them to jump first. And a large amount of that was down to McAlpine, who the company that constructed Eden. Cullen McAlpine, who is one of the most self-deprecating men you've ever met. He refuses to take the accolades for it. But at a certain point, he said, I'm still here. What's wrong with you lot? I've got my personal money in this project, by which point he'd spent several millions of pounds doing the feasibility with us because we didn't have the money. So we'd spent up our money, so he was putting it because he believed in it. And I think for a lot of the public servants, that was the moment when they felt they were going to look really bad and unentrepreneurial if they didn't actually now bend their own rules and whatever to be able to come in, because it would have looked really bad if a private sector guy had actually lost his shirt on a public sector project because they didn't have the nerve to go first. And that was a marvelous moment, actually. I didn't mean to describe it negatively, but we often think of business as people in suits and big ivory towers. Ultimately, it boils down, great stuff boils down to a kitchen table or a table with some ordinary people with flesh and blood saying, crikey, let's just go, let's do it. And actually, I think there are a lot of things in this world we could do marvelously if we had a bit more of that spirit and had a lot fewer lawyers and accountants getting in the way.
Well, that's a beautiful illustration of this theme that's in this conversation about story, isn't it? That you're able to make a story that's big, that's exciting, that people want to affiliate with, and again and again it sounds as though you've produced that story at the critical moment and said, do you want to be part of this? We're offering you a chance to do something magnificent, you know. Don't you want to come along with this? Do you want to look back later and say, I missed the opportunity? And that story is the driving, it's like the huge tool you've got to wield, isn't it?
It is, and it's got to be wielded with a gentleness. There is something horrible about the genuine language of threat. If you don't do this, you're going to be... and I think one of the things that's amazed me most about doing Eden has been the pleasure of dealing with some super people that were just waiting for an opportunity and the right phrasing of something to be able to offer the assistance that would have been in their heart, but it looked as if the systems wouldn't allow. And I think very often, a lot of people are deeply frustrated that they are in jobs or have responsibilities which on paper say we should support exciting stuff, but the mechanisms for allowing money to outflow are so, they're written by people who don't understand business, so they don't understand you got to, so for example in this country, all of the big projects have to have feasibilities, but the government doesn't pay for feasibility, so who does? So you're wondering why. I mean, the lottery was a most extraordinary thing which has transformed the constructed landscape of Britain, because it provided some monies up front to enable some of this stuff to take place. But ultimately, the world was left with private sector investment in general for new stuff, and that was always going to be purely money-based into the letting space or the commercial activity taking place in it. And that's why I think there's such a big gap in the national record of building new great institutional buildings, because no one knew how to start them. There was no, there was no first line. We had to spend, the Lost Garden of Heligan had to spend £700,000 of our money, personal money, to get to a stage where the state felt confident enough to contribute some money. So if they'd said no, we could have lost Heligan to do something that actually belongs to the nation, which is a terrible weakness of a system.
It is, it is.
Doesn't half concentrate the mind, though.
Well, yeah, absolutely. We're going to run out of time on it. A couple of things I want to make sure I get back to. And one of them was that there's a kind of a growth, and I wonder if you can describe this better than I can, but it seems to me as I look at the Heligan project and then this project, I see the Eden project as being a very natural growth from the Heligan project, but having in a sense quite different objectives. I mean that really this is an educational project to a very large extent, but education done very, very cleverly. Education that's fun to participate in. But there's also a story, a statement, a series of understandings that are at the heart of the Eden project that are different from what was at Heligan. Right?
It's certainly true. There's a difference between Heligan and Eden. I mean, Heligan, I like to see as sustainable landscape management in a, if you like, a Georgian context, reimagined in the 21st century, if you know what I mean. The great estates, actually, it breaks my heart to say this, but one of the only things you can say in favour of aristocracy is that it demonstrates that humans who are thinking of the future are capable of doing wonderful things. And the problem is our provincial lives as citizens often prevent us having a longer term vision. The biggest testament of the last 100 years in terms of landscape will be motorway verges. You think about it, that's true. All the plants we've planted next to motorways. You know, that's the biggest landscape contribution we've made. Heligan, I always say my heart is at Heligan and my head is at Eden. And that's perhaps a function simply of time and the amount of stories that have been told in both. I think Eden is powerful for very different reasons. It is about taking the most derelict land you can imagine and demonstrating that by human will and ingenuity, you can refresh, regenerate even the most unlikely of venues. It also shows the remediative effects of plants themselves as an actual thing, as opposed to them just being the skin of a pit. They actually were involved in phytoremediation, taking minerals out that shouldn't be here, and also became part of the structure that actually keeps the slopes stable. The stories we want to tell are about human dependence on the natural world here in the widest context, whereas Heligan is more about the balances. It's the local to the global. We are the global, Heligan is the local. I think it's hard to push the story too far one way or the other, because they are both ultimately demonstrations of the same, many of the same things, but with the issue of regeneration being different. Although Heligan in its dereliction became a symbol of regeneration in another way, with restoration, and the impact of Heligan on the village of Mevagissey by creating 100 jobs and creating a focus where visitors came. It transformed the village, completely transformed it. And I think the transformative narrative about a place like Helligan and a place like Eden is one of the really interesting things about the investment in something that is beautiful and above the normal. There's something about reaching to be above us, and it's only if it's above us that our... This sounds awfully pretentious, but it is only by shooting for the stars that other people can see, people around you can actually see the scope of what we're capable of. And I think beauty and harmonious living, which you have at Helligan, the power to take the most derelict place and do it, whatever, is really uplifting to people. It gives you optimism and hope, which are the most powerful fuels we have.
The way I originally conceived of this interview and this story, which is really what we're doing, was that latter point, that you had this incredible quarry, this big hole in the ground that was way down below the water table, and it really was a pretty terrible looking place. And seeing that transformed into something, magnificent and uplifting and beautiful, that's in a way the first of the environmental stories. But when I actually came, what I took away, and I'm not a young man, it was a little late in the game to be figuring this out, but what I actually took away was that sense of the reliance we have on plants in so many ways that you kind of know and you don't know at all. And that this, in a sense, brought that up and said, look at all these plants, look what they've done for you personally. Or conversely, there's your lovely dead dog exhibit that says, look what happens when the plants go away. Dead cat, yes, right. But look what happens when the plants go away. And so I guess if you were advising somebody else who was trying to regenerate a post-industrial mess like this one, are there any particular points that you think are really critical that they should know at the outset?
It depends on whether they're doing it in order to create a business, or whether they're doing it because they want to create a new story for the place they live in. In terms of the physical intervention of making soil, growing things, those sort of things are quite self-evident. There's a body of work which would demonstrate how you could physically transform a space. I think the biggest tip I ever give people is to believe a bit in magic. As you know, I believe in Tinkerbell theory. I said that to you before. And Tinkerbell, of course, is the fairy from Peter Pan that can only be seen if everybody believes in her. And I think wherever you are, if you build something magic, not only will people come, but it actually inspires other people to do their stuff. If you look at the Eden impact, people often talk about the Eden effect, which is incredibly flattering, but the effect is a strange one. A lot of places where you have dereliction are infected by a strange atmosphere of bereavement, a bit like industry that once was that now isn't, people that used to tread these places which now don't, all that sort of stuff. And that gentle melancholy then leads to a sense that this place is infected with despair. Good things will not happen here. Success has been stolen from this place. This can lead to an entire people who live there being hugely dispirited and then have no ambition. You make something of great beauty and attraction in that sort of environment. A, people will like it and they will come, but B, so many of the people who had hope and ambition that had been cowed because they thought bad luck haunts this land will suddenly say, bad luck doesn't haunt this place. Look at that beauty. We will invest in the amount of restaurants and hotels and things that have been built. If you bring loads of wealth to do stuff, because suddenly the bad luck had been lifted. Of course, it was never real, but people are. There's a lovely phrase by Ben Okri, the famous Nigerian writer, who said, "A nation and a people are the sum of the stories they tell themselves about themselves." Individuals and people that tell themselves lies leave the ground poisoned and will forever be unflowered. those that tell themselves truths will leave the ground fertile for future flowering. And I think that's a really important phrase. I always carry that around in my head because I saw what happened here and the amount of people who thought that the place was dying, who suddenly said, no, it isn't. And of course it wasn't, and the place is transformed. And that could happen in Alberta or the mining areas of the north of Canada. It could happen in Utah. It could happen anywhere. But you just need to be brave enough to believe in beauty and lovely stuff. And it's almost as if believing in those softer things is actually the magic that's necessary to uplift the spirit to actually do stuff. And I'm sounding like a muesli weaver as I say this, but actually I'm spiritual with a small s. I believe passionately that if you can create the right mood music in a place, other people will be able to play in harmony with it.
And it's something that a person should do.
And it's something that a person would do, because actually at the end of your life, I think, we're all going to be reluctant to shuffle off this mortal coil because we're uncertain of what might lie ahead. Compost, probably, who knows. But actually, I think, just as I went back to the reason why I decided to change my life when I went to Heligan, to try and be as good as I could be, whereas I'd been busking before, there's a completely different sense of satisfaction to doing your very best to do something that's beautiful and wonderful. Because, you know, when you fail, but you've tried your best, you don't actually have many regrets. I tried my best, I failed, you know. But to fail because you didn't have the courage to try to be the best, I think that is something that makes you miserable as you go to your grave. Whereas to actually be, you know, shuffling off, actually saying, I did the best, and hopefully the place that I lived in is the better for me having been around than not, is about as honourable as it can get. Anything else is affectation and vanity.
Sir Tim Smit, businessman, artist, and practical visionary. If you enjoyed this interview, with its emphasis on the living natural world, you may want to look at our conversation with Diana Beresford-Kroger about trees, or our interview with Dr. Bridget Stutchbury about birds. For The Green Interview, I'm Silver Donald Cameron. See you next time.